The transport ship Valiant Dawn shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Cadet Marcus Chun pressed his face against the small porthole to catch his first glimpse of the Arcturus Military Academy. The massive space station hung in orbit around a blue-white star, its hull gleaming like polished steel. Docking arms extended from its core like the spokes of a wheel, each one large enough to accommodate capital ships. This was where the galaxy's best military minds were forged, where officers from dozens of species learned to command fleets that protected countless worlds. Marcus pulled back from the window and checked his uniform one more time. The dark blue fabric was crisp and new, the Earth insignia on his collar barely worn. At 19, he was younger than most cadets, but his test scores had been exceptional. What worried him wasn't his age or his academics. It was everything else. "First time seeing the academy?" asked a voice behind him. Marcus turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered figure in the same cadet uniform. The speaker had 4 arms, gray-blue skin, and the distinctive ridge patterns of a corvid. His name tag read Vex. "Yes," Marcus replied. "Pretty impressive." Vex nodded, but his expression seemed skeptical as he looked Marcus up and down. "You're the Terran, right? I heard we had one this year." The way he said Terran made it sound like a curiosity rather than a species designation. Marcus had gotten used to that tone over the past few weeks during processing. Humans had only joined the Galactic Defense Coalition 5 years ago, after making contact with the broader galactic community. Most species still saw them as newcomers, unproven and probably fragile. "Marcus Chun," he said, extending his hand. Vex looked at the gesture with confusion before tentatively reaching out with one of his 4 hands. The handshake was awkward. "Vex Thornan. I'm from the Corvin Core Worlds." He paused, then added, "My family has served in the Coalition military for 8 generations." The implication was clear. Marcus nodded politely. "This is all new for my people. I'm hoping to learn from everyone here." Other cadets began gathering their gear as the ship moved toward its docking port. Marcus noticed how they clustered in small groups, mostly by species. There were the Corvins with their multiple arms and military bearing, a cluster of insect like Thexani, whose chittering conversation sounded like static, and several Zephyrians whose tall, graceful forms moved with an almost dancer-like precision. A few other species were represented by 1s and 2s. Marcus found himself alone with his single duffel bag as they disembarked. The docking bay was enormous, filled with the controlled chaos of new arrivals. Automated systems guided groups toward different processing stations, while holographic displays showed schedules and room assignments. Cadets, form up by species for orientation processing, announced a voice over the station's communication system. The other groups moved efficiently toward designated areas marked with their respective symbols. Marcus looked around for the Terran section and finally spotted a small sign near the far wall with Earth's blue and green symbol. He walked over to find himself completely alone. The processing station was automated, with a simple scanner that read his identification chip and provided him with a data pad containing his schedule, room assignment, and basic academy information. "Room 847C, Residential Block 7, he read aloud. The data pad also included a map, which was helpful since the station was larger than many cities back on Earth. As he made his way through the corridors, Marcus couldn't help but notice the architecture. Everything was built to accommodate multiple species, with varying ceiling heights, different atmospheric controls in different sections, and corridors wide enough for beings much larger than humans. He passed a group of Corvin upperclassmen who towered over him, their conversation stopping as they noticed him walking by. "Is that the human?" one of them asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "Must be. I heard they're pretty fragile." Surprised, they let one into the academy at all. Marcus kept walking, his face neutral. He'd expected this kind of reaction, but it still stung. Earth's military record was limited to conflicts with themselves, which didn't exactly inspire confidence among species that had been fighting interstellar wars for centuries. Residential Block 7 turned out to be one of the newer sections of the station, with clean lines and efficient design. Room 847. C was small, but adequate, with a bed, desk, storage unit, and a small viewport looking out into space. Marcus unpacked his few belongings and sat down at the desk to review his course schedule. The Academy program was intensive. Tactical analysis, fleet command principles, xenobiology, galactic history, advanced physics, and combat training. Each course was taught by officers with extensive field experience, and the academic standards were notoriously high. Only about 60% of cadets who started the program would graduate. A soft chime indicated someone was at his door. Marcus opened it to find a woman about his age wearing the same cadet uniform, but with silver skin that seemed to shimmer in the corridor lighting. Her name tag identified her as Lyra Snowdrift. "You must be the Terran Cadet," she said with a smile. "I'm Lyra, from the Zephyrian contingent. I wanted to introduce myself since we're in several classes together. Marcus Chun, nice to meet you." This time the handshake went more smoothly, though Lyra's grip was surprisingly strong. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for dinner in the main cafeteria. It could be overwhelming on the first day, and it might be easier to navigate together." Marcus appreciated the friendly gesture. "That sounds great, thank you." The main cafeteria was a vast space with hundreds of tables and food stations designed to accommodate dozens of different species' dietary requirements. The noise level was considerable, with conversations in multiple languages creating a constant background hum. Marcus followed Lyra to the human-compatible food stations, which offered a reasonable selection of familiar options. "So what made you decide on the Academy?" Lyra asked as they found a table near one of the large viewports overlooking the planet below. "I've always been interested in military strategy and space exploration," Marcus replied. "When the opportunity opened up for humans to apply, I couldn't pass it up." "What about you?" "Family tradition, mostly. My mother was a fleet commander, and her mother before that. Zephyrian culture places a high value on military service." She paused to take a bite of something that looked like fruit, but was probably from a plant Marcus had never seen. "I have to ask, though, are you nervous about the physical requirements? I've heard human physiology is quite different from most coalition species." It was a polite way of asking if he was worried about being too weak to keep up. Marcus had wondered the same thing himself. Human strength and endurance were average at best compared to most galactic species, and their reflexes were slower than many. But they'd passed all the entrance requirements, so the Academy obviously thought they were capable. "I'm sure it will be challenging," he said, "but humans have always been good at adapting to difficult situations." Over the next few days, Marcus began to understand just how challenging it would be. The first week consisted mostly of orientation sessions, basic assessments, and getting familiar with the Academy systems. Even these preliminary activities made it clear that he was at a significant disadvantage. During the physical fitness assessments, Marcus performed adequately by human standards, but ranked near the bottom of his class overall. The Corvin's 4 arms gave them advantages in many exercises, while the Thexani's natural agility made them excel at obstacle courses. Even Lyra, despite being friendly and helpful, consistently outperformed him in tests of speed and coordination. The academic assessments were more encouraging. Marcus scored well in tactical analysis and strategic thinking, and his mathematical abilities were solid. However, courses like xenobiology and galactic history required him to learn vast amounts of information that other cadets had been familiar with since childhood. "Don't let it get to you," Lyra said one evening as they studied together in the library. "Everyone has different strengths. The Academy wouldn't have accepted you if they didn't think you could succeed." Marcus appreciated her encouragement, but he was starting to see the skeptical looks from other cadets and even some instructors. During tactical simulations, he was often assigned to support roles rather than leadership positions. In group projects, his suggestions were politely acknowledged, but rarely implemented. It wasn't malicious, but the message was clear. Nobody expected much from the human. The real test came during the first major evaluation exercise 3 weeks into the semester. The exercise was designed to assess leadership potential under pressure, with cadets rotating through command positions in simulated crisis scenarios. Each scenario became progressively more complex, testing not just knowledge, but also the ability to make quick decisions and inspire confidence in subordinates. Marcus watched as other cadets took their turns. Vex commanded a simulated fleet engagement with practiced efficiency, his 4 arms allowing him to manage multiple control interfaces simultaneously. A Thexani cadet named Zix handled a hostage rescue scenario with remarkable speed and precision. Lyra demonstrated exceptional diplomatic skills while managing a first contact situation with a hostile alien species. When Marcus's turn came, he was assigned a scenario involving a natural disaster on a mining colony. A massive solar flare had knocked out the colony's main power systems and damaged their orbital platforms. 3,000 colonists needed to be evacuated before their life support failed, but the evacuation ships had limited capacity and some of the colonists were trapped in collapsed mining tunnels. Marcus studied the situation display, noting the positions of available ships, the status of the colony's infrastructure, and the timeline before life support failure. The other cadets in his group waited for his orders, their expressions ranging from polite attention to barely concealed doubt. First priority is establishing communication with the colony leadership, Marcus said, activating the simulation's communication systems. We need to know exactly how many people are trapped and where. A Corvin cadet named Dex shifted impatiently. Shouldn't we just start the evacuation immediately? Every minute we wait, more people could die. Without accurate information, we could waste time and resources evacuating empty areas while people die in locations we don't know about, Marcus replied calmly. Information is our most valuable resource right now. The simulation provided responses from the colony, confirming that approximately 200 miners were trapped in the lower levels while the main population was gathered in emergency shelters. The evacuation ships could handle the main population in 2 trips, but reaching the trapped miners would require specialized equipment that would take time to deploy. I recommend we split our resources, suggested a Zephyrian cadet named Kai. Send the evacuation ships for the main population while a smaller team goes after the trapped miners. Marcus shook his head. The mining tunnels are unstable. Sending a small team down there would just create more casualties. Instead, we're going to use the mining equipment. The other cadets looked confused. Dex spoke up again. The mining equipment was damaged in the flare. The simulation data shows it as non-functional. The primary control systems were damaged, Marcus agreed, but the mechanical systems are still intact. These are industrial excavation machines designed to operate in hostile environments. We can operate them manually. Marcus began issuing orders, directing the evacuation ships to begin moving the main population while a technical team worked to manually activate the mining equipment. It was a complex operation that required precise timing and coordination. This is taking too long, Dex muttered as the simulation clock continued counting down. We should have started with standard rescue procedures. Marcus ignored the comment and continued coordinating the operation. The mining equipment came online just as the first evacuation ships departed with loads of colonists. The heavy excavation machines began cutting through the collapsed sections of tunnel, their progress slow but steady. Life support systems at 30%, announced the simulation. Time was running out. Evacuation ships returning for second load, reported Kai. But the tunnel operation isn't complete yet. Marcus studied the display again. At the current rate, they would reach the trapped miners with only minutes to spare before life support failure. It would be close, very close. Divert power from non-essential systems throughout the colony to extend life support, he ordered, and prep the medical bay on the primary evacuation ship. Some of these miners have been trapped for hours and will need immediate treatment. The final minutes of the simulation were tense. The mining equipment broke through to the trapped miners just as life support dropped to critical levels. The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with all colonists successfully rescued and transported to safety with minimal casualties. When the simulation ended, the room was quiet for a moment. The supervising instructor, a veteran Corvin officer named Commander Thane, reviewed the results on his display. Interesting approach, Cadet Chun, he said finally. Unconventional, but effective. Final casualty count: 0 deaths, 12 minor injuries. Evacuation completed with 4 minutes and 37 seconds of life support remaining. Marcus felt a surge of relief, but Commander Thane wasn't finished. However, your decision to manually operate the mining equipment was extremely risky. If the machines had failed or if the tunnels had collapsed further, you would have lost everyone. Yes, sir, Marcus replied. But standard rescue procedures would have taken too long. The risk was calculated. Commander Thane nodded slowly. Indeed, acceptable performance overall. He turned to address the other cadets. This scenario has been run 47 times since the beginning of the semester. Cadet Chin's approach was unique and achieved one of the better outcomes. As the cadets filed out of the simulation chamber, Marcus noticed that some of the skeptical looks had been replaced by expressions of grudging respect. Dex approached him in the corridor outside. That was good thinking with the mining equipment, the Corvin said. I wouldn't have considered that option. Thank you, Marcus replied. It wasn't exactly enthusiastic praise, but it was acknowledgement. Lyra caught up with him as they headed back toward the residential blocks. You see, I told you everyone has different strengths. You think differently than the rest of us, and that can be valuable. Marcus appreciated her support, but he knew one successful simulation didn't change much. He was still the physically weakest cadet in his class, still learning basic information that others took for granted, and still facing skepticism from instructors and fellow cadets alike. That evening, he sat in his room reviewing the day's lessons and preparing for the next round of courses. Through his viewport, he could see the blue-white star that provided light to this system, its brilliance undimmed by the vast distances of space. Somewhere out there were threats that the coalition military worked to prevent, challenges that required the best officers they could train. Marcus was determined to prove that humans deserved a place among those officers, even if he had to do it quietly and one small success at a time. The academy was just the beginning, and he had a lot more to learn before anyone would truly believe that human resilience was something to be taken seriously. The next few weeks would test that resilience in ways he couldn't yet imagine, but tonight he felt like he'd taken a small step forward. Sometimes that was enough. The Academy's training programs intensified dramatically after the first month. What had begun as basic assessments and orientation evolved into rigorous courses designed to push cadets to their limits. Marcus found himself struggling to keep pace, not just academically, but physically and socially as well. Combat training was particularly challenging. The Academy's philosophy emphasized that every officer needed to be capable in personal combat, regardless of their eventual specialization. The training facility was a vast complex with multiple environments: zero-gravity chambers, high-gravity rooms, underwater sections, and traditional ground-based combat areas. Marcus stood with his training group in the main combat gymnasium, watching as instructor Valdez demonstrated techniques for different species. The Corvin martial arts instructor was a compact but powerful figure who moved with surprising grace despite having 4 arms. Combat effectiveness is about understanding your advantages and your opponent's weaknesses, Valdez explained to the assembled cadets. Each species brings different strengths to a fight. Corvins have multiple limbs and superior strength. Zephyrians have speed and agility. Thexani have natural armor and reflexes. Understanding these differences can mean the survival of your crew. Marcus glanced around at his fellow cadets. Over the past month, the class had begun to sort itself into informal hierarchies based on performance. Vex had emerged as an unofficial leader among the Corvins, while Lyra was respected for her diplomatic skills and tactical thinking. Even among the smaller species groups, certain individuals had distinguished themselves. Marcus, meanwhile, remained largely invisible, not failing but not excelling either, just adequate enough to avoid notice, which was both a relief and a frustration. Today we'll be practicing cross-species sparring, Valdez continued. The goal is not to injure your opponent, but to demonstrate effective techniques while defending against their natural advantages. The class was divided into pairs for the exercise. Marcus found himself matched against a Thexani cadet named Zix, whose insect-like appearance included natural chitin plating that served as armor. Zix was fast, probably twice as quick as Marcus, and those natural reflexes made him a formidable opponent. "Don't worry, Terran," Zix said as they faced each other in the sparring ring. "I'll try not to hurt you too badly." The comment drew some chuckles from the watching cadets. Marcus nodded politely, but said nothing. He learned that responding to such remarks usually made things worse. When the match began, Zix immediately pressed his advantage, using his speed to attack from multiple angles. Marcus found himself purely on the defensive, trying to anticipate where the next strike would come from. The Thexani's natural agility made him incredibly difficult to counterattack. For the first 2 minutes of the match, Marcus simply tried to avoid getting hit. Zix's strikes came fast and from unexpected angles, and Marcus could hear some of the watching cadets making comments about human reflexes and durability. But as the match continued, Marcus began to notice patterns in Zix's attacks. The Thexani was fast, but he was also predictable. His natural agility made him overconfident, and he tended to repeat successful attack sequences rather than varying his approach. Marcus started to adjust his defensive strategy. Instead of trying to match Zix's speed, he began to anticipate where the attacks were coming from and position himself accordingly. When Zix launched into a familiar combination of strikes, Marcus was ready. He stepped inside the Thexani's reach and grabbed 2 of his arms, using Zix's own momentum to throw him off balance. Before Zix could recover, Marcus had him in a hold that neutralized his speed advantage. The match was over. The gymnasium was quiet for a moment. Zix picked himself up, chittering in what Marcus had learned was the Thexani equivalent of embarrassed laughter. "Good match," the insect cadet said, offering what passed for a handshake among his species. "I didn't expect that technique." "You're very fast," Marcus replied. "I had to find a different approach." Instructor Valdez nodded approvingly. "Effective adaptation, Cadet Chun. Speed and agility are significant advantages, but they can become predictable if overused." "Well done." The approval from the instructor was gratifying, but Marcus noticed that some of the other cadets seemed less impressed than surprised. It was as if they'd expected him to lose and weren't quite sure how to process his victory. After combat training, the academic courses presented different but equally significant challenges. Galactic history was taught by Professor Kamal, an elderly Zephyrian whose knowledge of interstellar conflicts spanned several centuries. The course covered major wars, diplomatic crises, and the formation of the current coalition structure. Today we'll discuss the Vorthan Rebellion, Professor Kamal announced as the cadets settled into their seats in the lecture hall. This conflict, which occurred approximately 200 standard years ago, demonstrates the importance of understanding cultural factors in military planning. Marcus activated his datapad and began taking notes. The Vorthan Rebellion was mentioned briefly in the introductory materials, but like many historical events, the full details were considered common knowledge among galactic species. The Vorthan system had been part of the coalition for 50 years when the rebellion began. Professor Kamal continued. "Can anyone tell me what sparked the initial uprising?" Several hands went up around the room. The professor called on a Corvan cadet named Harks. "Religious differences," Harks answered confidently. The Vorthans practiced a form of ancestor worship that conflicted with coalition policies regarding historical preservation. "Close, but not entirely accurate," Professor Kamal replied. The religious aspects were significant, but the primary issue was economic. The coalition's mining operations were disrupting sites that the Vorthans considered sacred, but the real problem was that local communities weren't receiving any benefit from the resource extraction. Marcus found himself fascinated by the complexity of the conflict. The rebellion had lasted 15 years, and involved multiple species with changing alliances and objectives that evolved over time. It wasn't the simple military history he'd expected, but rather a complicated study in politics, economics, and cultural sensitivity. The turning point came when coalition forces attempted to occupy the Vorthan capital, Professor Kemal explained. This action unified previously competing factions against what they saw as foreign invasion. Can anyone analyze why this was a strategic error? This time, Marcus raised his hand. Professor Kemal looked mildly surprised, but nodded for him to answer. The coalition forces were thinking in terms of conventional military objectives, Marcus said. Control the capital, control the system. But they didn't understand that Vorthan society was decentralized. Taking the capital actually made the conflict worse by validating the rebels' claims about coalition imperialism. Professor Kemal smiled, the first genuinely pleased expression Marcus had seen from him. Excellent analysis, Cadet Shun. The occupation of the capital was indeed counterproductive. It transformed a series of local disputes into a unified resistance movement. After class, Lyra caught up with Marcus in the corridor. That was insightful, she said. Most cadets would have focused on the military tactics, but you understood the political dimension. It seemed relevant, Marcus replied. Military action without political context is usually ineffective. True, but it's not always obvious to people trained in conventional military thinking. Lyra paused as they walked. Can I ask you something? How much military history do humans actually have? It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had been expecting. Quite a bit, actually. We've been fighting wars for thousands of years. The problem is that it's all been internal conflict. We never had to deal with other species until 5 years ago. But that might actually be an advantage, Lyra suggested. Most galactic species learned military strategy in the context of interspecies warfare. Humans learned it from fighting each other, which means you understand conflict between groups with similar capabilities and resources. Marcus hadn't considered that perspective before. It was an interesting thought. The evening study sessions in the library had become routine for Marcus. While other cadets often studied in species-specific groups, Marcus usually worked alone or occasionally with Lyra, who seemed to enjoy discussing different perspectives on their coursework. Tonight, however, their usual quiet corner of the library was occupied by a group of Corvin cadets led by Vex. They were working on a tactical analysis assignment that was due the following week. Mind if we join you? Lyra asked as they approached with their materials. Of course, Vex replied, though Marcus noticed he seemed less enthusiastic about Marcus's presence than Lyra's. The assignment involved analyzing a historical fleet engagement and identifying the key factors that determined the outcome. Each cadet had been given the same basic information, but was expected to develop their own analysis and conclusions. The Battle of Nexus Prime is pretty straightforward, said Dex, one of the Corvin cadets. Superior numbers and firepower. The coalition fleet was simply outgunned. I think it's more complicated than that, Lyra disagreed. The enemy fleet had numerical superiority, but the coalition had better positioning and used it effectively. Marcus studied the battle data on his display. The engagement had taken place in a binary star system with unusual gravitational effects that influenced ship movement and targeting. The coalition fleet had been outnumbered 3-2, but had achieved a decisive victory with minimal losses. What do you think, Marcus? Vex asked. There was something in his tone that suggested he was testing more than asking. Marcus considered his answer carefully. I think the key factor was information asymmetry, he said finally. The Corvin cadets exchanged glances. Information asymmetry? Vex asked. The coalition fleet knew about the gravitational anomalies in the system because they'd been studying them for months, Marcus explained. The enemy fleet arrived expecting a standard engagement. When the coalition ships used the gravitational fields to slingshot around the primary star, it completely disrupted the enemy formation. He activated his data pad's display function and projected a three-dimensional model of the battle space. Look at the timing. The enemy fleet maintains standard attack formation right up until the coalition ships appeared to retreat toward the star. They assumed it was a withdrawal and moved to pursue. Marcus manipulated the display to show the gravitational fields around the binary stars. But the coalition ships were using the star's gravity well to increase their velocity and change direction. When they came around the star, they were moving 50% faster than normal and attacking from an unexpected angle. Vex leaned forward to study the display. That's actually brilliant tactical thinking. I focused on the ship movements, but didn't consider the environmental factors. Most people wouldn't, Marcus replied. The gravitational effects weren't obvious from the basic data. You had to cross-reference with the stellar cartography files to understand what was happening. Lyra smiled. That's what I mean about thinking differently. Most of us would analyze this as a conventional fleet engagement, but you saw it as a problem of information and environmental factors. The study session continued for another 2 hours, with the cadets sharing different perspectives on the battle analysis. Marcus found himself contributing more to the discussion than usual, and noticed that the Corvin cadets were actually listening to his suggestions rather than dismissing them. When they finally packed up their materials, Vex approached Marcus privately. I owe you an apology, the Corvin said quietly. I had some preconceptions about humans that weren't fair. No apology necessary, Marcus replied. Humans are new to all this. It's reasonable to be skeptical. Maybe, but skepticism shouldn't turn into prejudice. Vex paused. Would you be interested in joining our study group permanently? We could use different perspectives. Marcus was surprised by the offer. I'd like that, thank you. As the weeks continued, Marcus found his position in the class gradually shifting. He was still not the strongest or fastest cadet, and his knowledge of galactic history and culture remained limited compared to his classmates. But increasingly, other cadets sought out his opinions on tactical problems and strategic questions. The change became more apparent during the semester's major field exercise. The entire cadet class was transported to a moon orbiting the system's outer planet for a week-long military simulation. The moon's surface was harsh and barren, with thin atmosphere and extreme temperature variations between day and night. The exercise scenario involved establishing and defending a forward operating base while conducting reconnaissance operations across the moon's surface. Cadets were divided into squads of 8, with leadership roles rotating every 2 days to give everyone command experience. Marcus found himself assigned to Squad 7 along with Lyra, Vex, Zix, and 4 other cadets from various species. Their first objective was to establish a defensive perimeter around their assigned sector, and then conduct a reconnaissance mission to locate enemy positions. The squad's first leader was a Zephyrian cadet named Kala, who organized their initial setup efficiently. The defensive perimeter was established according to standard coalition doctrine, with sensor nets and automated weapons positioned to cover likely approach routes. But when they began the reconnaissance mission, problems became apparent. The moon's surface was more challenging than expected, with deep ravines and unstable rock formations that made standard movement techniques ineffective. Worse, the thin atmosphere meant that traditional communication equipment had limited range. We're behind schedule, Kala reported to the squad as they paused in a shallow crater to assess their progress. At this rate, we won't reach the reconnaissance objective before nightfall. Night on the moon brought temperatures that would be lethal to most species without proper shelter. The squad had portable heating units, but they were bulky and would slow movement even further. We could split into smaller groups, suggested one of the cadets. Cover more ground faster. Bad idea. Vex replied immediately. If anyone gets in trouble, the rest of the squad might not be able to reach them in time. Marcus studied the terrain map on his display, noting the topographical features between their current position and the objective. The direct route was blocked by a series of steep ravines, while the longer route around the obstacles would take too much time. What if we go under instead of around, he suggested. The other squad members looked confused. Lyra checked her map display. Under what? The ravines, Marcus explained. Look at the geological survey data. These aren't just surface cracks. They're part of an extensive cave system. If we can access the caves, we might be able to travel most of the distance underground. Kala frowned. Cave systems are dangerous. We could get lost or trapped. True, Marcus agreed. But the surface route is guaranteed to take too long. And the caves would provide protection from temperature extremes. Zix was studying the geological data. The cave system does extend in the right direction, and my species has some natural advantages for underground movement. After some discussion, Kala decided to try Marcus's suggestion. The squad made their way to one of the larger ravine openings and descended into the cave system. The underground route was indeed complex, with multiple branching passages and occasional obstacles, but Zix's natural abilities proved invaluable for navigation. The cave route allowed them to cover distance much faster than surface travel would have permitted. They emerged near their reconnaissance objective with several hours to spare before nightfall, and completed their mission successfully. Good thinking on the caves, Kala said as they made camp for the night. I wouldn't have considered that option. It was just problem solving, Marcus replied. When the obvious solution doesn't work, you look for alternatives. The next day brought a new challenge when leadership rotated to Vex. Their squad was tasked with conducting a defensive action against an attacking force while protecting a simulated civilian evacuation. The scenario was complex, with multiple objectives and time constraints. Vex organized the defense competently, positioning squad members to maximize their individual strengths. But as the exercise progressed, it became clear that the attacking force was using unconventional tactics that didn't match standard coalition threat assessments. They're not attacking our strong points, Lyra observed as they monitored enemy movements. Instead, they're probing for weaknesses in our communication and supply lines. Marcus watched the tactical display and noticed a pattern in the enemy movements. They're not trying to defeat us directly, he realized. They're trying to delay us long enough for the civilian evacuation to fail. This insight changed the entire approach to the defense. Instead of trying to stop the enemy attacks, the squad focused on maintaining the evacuation schedule while conducting a fighting withdrawal. It was a much more complex operation, but it successfully achieved the primary objective. When Marcus's turn to lead came on the fourth day, the squad faced their most difficult challenge yet. They were assigned to assault a heavily fortified position while coordinating with two other squads in a multi-pronged attack. The enemy position was well-designed and defended with overlapping fields of fire and multiple backup positions. Marcus studied the tactical situation for nearly an hour before briefing his squad. The standard approach would be a coordinated assault from multiple directions, using each squad's strengths to overwhelm different aspects of a defense. But Marcus had noticed something in the intelligence reports that suggested a different approach. We're not going to assault the main position, he announced to his surprised squad members. What? Vex asked. That's the objective. The objective is to neutralize the enemy position, Marcus corrected. There's more than one way to do that. Marcus explained his analysis of the intelligence data. The fortified position was powered by a geothermal plant located several kilometers away. The power plant was lightly defended because it was considered too far from the main battle area to be threatened. But without power, the fortress's automated defenses would fail. It's a long shot, Lyra admitted as they reviewed the plan. If we're wrong about the power requirements, we'll have wasted the entire exercise. And if the other squads can't coordinate their attacks properly, they'll be slaughtered, Zix added. Marcus nodded. Those are real risks. But the standard approach has maybe a 30% chance of success with acceptable casualties. This plan has a 70% chance of complete success. After some debate, the squad agreed to try Marcus's approach. They conducted a covert movement to the geothermal plant while the other squads prepared for their assaults. The plant was indeed lightly defended, and the squad was able to disable it with minimal resistance. When the power failed at the main fortress, the automated defenses went offline, and the enemy garrison was forced to rely on manual systems. The coordinated assault by the other two squads succeeded with remarkably light casualties. Outstanding tactical innovation, commented Major Saren, the exercise supervisor, during the post-mission briefing. Cadet Chen's analysis of the enemy's infrastructure vulnerabilities turned what should have been a costly frontal assault into a precision operation. The praise was gratifying, but what struck Marcus more was the reaction of his squad mates. They no longer seemed surprised by his unconventional thinking, but rather had come to expect and value it. On the transport flight back to the academy, Vex approached Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about something," the Corvin said. "All semester, I've been comparing everyone to traditional models of military leadership. Strong, decisive, charismatic. But you're effective in completely different ways." "I'm not sure I follow," Marcus replied. "You don't try to be the strongest person in a room or the fastest thinker," Vex explained. "Instead, you look at problems from angles that the rest of us miss. You find solutions that work better than the obvious ones." Lyra, who had been listening to the conversation, nodded in agreement. "That's exactly right. Most of us were trained to think in terms of conventional military doctrine. You think in terms of solving problems." Marcus considered their observations. Maybe that's because humans had to develop different approaches to warfare. When everyone has similar capabilities, you can't win through superior strength or speed. You have to win through superior thinking. "Whatever the reason," Vex said, "it's effective. I hope we end up serving together after graduation." As the academy grew larger in the transport's viewports, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since his arrival months ago. He was still the physically weakest cadet in his class, still learning basic information about galactic culture and history. But he was no longer invisible or dismissed. The semester's final examinations were approaching, and Marcus knew they would be challenging. But for the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt confident that he belonged here. Not because he had proven himself to be like everyone else, but because he had proven himself to be valuable despite being different. Human resilience, he was beginning to understand, wasn't about being tougher than everyone else. It was about finding ways to succeed even when the odds were against you. And sometimes the best way to do that was to quietly prove that different approaches could be just as effective as traditional ones. The Academy's final semester brought with it the most demanding challenges yet. Advanced tactical simulations, comprehensive examinations, and the culminating exercise that would determine each cadet's fitness for commission as an officer in the Coalition Defense Force. Marcus had survived the earlier trials and earned a measure of respect from his classmates, but the ultimate test was still ahead. The semester began with an announcement that sent ripples of anxiety through the cadet corps. Admiral Korath, the Academy's commandant, addressed the assembled cadets in the main auditorium with news that would change everything. "Recent intelligence indicates increased activity along our border with the hegemony," the Admiral announced, his four arms gesturing toward a holographic display showing the galactic rim. "While we remain committed to peaceful coexistence, the Defense Force must be prepared for any eventuality. Your final exercises will therefore simulate real-world crisis scenarios based on current threat assessments." The hegemony was a loose alliance of aggressive species that had been expanding their territory for the past decade. Unlike the Coalition, which emphasized cooperation and mutual defense, the hegemony operated on principles of conquest and subjugation. They hadn't yet made any overtly hostile moves toward Coalition space, but their buildup of military forces was concerning. Marcus sat with his usual study group as Admiral Korath continued his briefing. The final exercise would span 2 weeks and involve the entire senior cadet class working together as a unified command structure. Unlike previous simulations, this exercise would have real stakes. Performance would directly influence graduation rankings and assignment preferences. "The scenario will test everything you've learned," Admiral Korath explained. "Strategic planning, tactical execution, leadership under pressure, and the ability to coordinate complex operations involving multiple species and specializations. Success will require the best efforts of every cadet. After the briefing, Marcus's study group gathered in their usual corner of the library to discuss the implications. The group had evolved over the semester to include cadets from multiple species, united more by their complementary skills than by their origins. 2 weeks is a long time for a single exercise, Lyra observed. They must be planning something elaborate. Vex nodded grimly. And using real-world scenarios means we won't be able to rely on standard textbook solutions. Whatever they throw at us will be designed to test our adaptability. Zix chittered nervously. My species doesn't perform well under extended stress. 2 weeks of high-pressure simulation could be difficult. We'll support each other, Marcus said quietly. That's what we've been doing all semester, and it's worked out well. The weeks leading up to the final exercise were intensive. Advanced courses covered topics like multi-species fleet coordination, rapid deployment logistics, and crisis communication protocols. Marcus found himself struggling with some of the technical material, but his growing reputation for unconventional problem-solving meant that other cadets often sought his input on complex scenarios. One evening, while reviewing logistics protocols in the library, Marcus was approached by a cadet he didn't recognize. The newcomer was a Corvin, but his uniform bore the insignia of a senior-year cadet from a different program track. "Excuse me," the Corvin said. "You're Cadet Shun, correct? The Terran who's been developing alternative tactical approaches." Marcus looked up from his data pad, curious. "That's me. Can I help you with something?" "Actually, I was hoping you might be able to help with a theoretical problem I've been working on." The Corvin sat down across from Marcus. "I'm Thex Gorin, Advanced Strategic Studies Program. I've heard about some of your unconventional solutions to tactical problems." Marcus was surprised to be sought out by a senior cadet, especially one from the advanced program that typically accepted only the highest-performing students. "What kind of problem?" Thex activated his own data pad and projected a complex three-dimensional display. "It's a theoretical engagement scenario involving a coalition fleet protecting a convoy against superior enemy forces. The conventional analysis suggests that the convoy can't be successfully defended, but my instructors believe there might be an unconventional approach that could work." Marcus studied the scenario carefully. The enemy fleet substantially outnumbered the coalition defenders, and the convoy consisted of slow-moving civilian vessels that couldn't outrun their pursuers. Every conventional tactical approach resulted in either the loss of the convoy or unacceptable casualties among the defending ships. "Interesting," Marcus murmured as he manipulated the display to examine different aspects of the scenario. "The convoy ships are civilian vessels, correct? Not military transport?" "Yes, mostly commercial freighters and passenger liners." "Why?" Marcus continued studying the data. "And the enemy objective is to capture the convoy intact, not destroy it?" Thex nodded. "According to the scenario parameters, yes. The cargo includes advanced technology that they want to acquire." "Then, the solution isn't military," Marcus said after several minutes of analysis. "It's economic." Thex looked confused. "Economic?" Marcus began modifying the display, highlighting specific ships in the convoy and their cargo manifests. "These freighters are carrying quantum processing cores, right? Extremely valuable and difficult to manufacture. But they're also extremely sensitive to electromagnetic interference." "Yes, that's correct. So instead of trying to defeat the enemy fleet in direct combat, you threaten to destroy the very thing they're trying to capture." Marcus showed how the defending fleet could position itself among the convoy ships. If the enemy attacks, the quantum cores get damaged by weapon discharges and become worthless. If they try to capture the convoy without fighting, they have to accept your terms for surrender. Thex stared at the display for a long moment. "That's not a military solution at all. It's essentially economic warfare. Sometimes the best military solution is to avoid the military engagement entirely," Marcus replied, "especially when you're outgunned." The senior cadet spent another hour discussing the implications of Marcus's approach, clearly impressed by the unconventional thinking. When he finally left, Marcus returned to his studies, but found himself thinking about the broader implications of their conversation. Word of his consultation with the advanced students spread through the academy faster than Marcus had expected. Within a few days, he found himself being approached by cadets from various programs who wanted to discuss tactical problems or seek input on their own projects. It was flattering, but also somewhat overwhelming. "You're becoming famous," Lyra teased one evening as they walked to dinner. "I saw 3 different cadets approach you today alone." "It's a bit much," Marcus admitted. "I'm still trying to keep up with my own coursework." "Maybe that's the point," Vex suggested as he joined them in the corridor. "You've developed a reputation for innovative thinking. That's valuable, especially with the final exercise coming up." The final exercise began on a Monday morning with a scenario briefing that left most cadets stunned by its complexity. The simulation involved a border crisis in which hegemony forces had occupied a neutral system and were threatening to attack coalition territory. The cadet corps was organized as a complete military command structure, with senior cadets filling major command roles and others assigned to various specializations. Marcus found himself assigned to the Strategic Analysis Division, working under a senior Zephyrian cadet named Commander Sean. His role was to assist in developing response options to the crisis scenario, analyzing intelligence data, and providing tactical recommendations to the senior command staff. The command center was a massive facility that replicated the bridge of a coalition flagship, with multiple workstations, communication arrays, and tactical displays showing the current situation. The scenario was remarkably detailed, with real-time updates simulating the flow of intelligence and changing conditions in the crisis zone. "Initial situation report," announced Commander Sean as the exercise began. "Hegemony forces have occupied the Centauri Crossroads system using what they claim is a peacekeeping intervention to protect their commercial interests. Coalition intelligence estimates approximately 50 enemy vessels, including several capital ships." Marcus studied the tactical display showing the disputed system. Centauri Crossroads was indeed strategically important, serving as a major trade route between coalition and neutral space. Its occupation by hegemony forces would give them significant leverage over commercial traffic. Coalition forces available for response include the 3rd Fleet, currently stationed at Arcturus Base, and elements of the 5th Fleet conducting exercises in the Vega system, Commander Sean continued. Total coalition strength, approximately 38 vessels. The numbers were sobering. Not only were coalition forces outnumbered, but they were also distributed across multiple locations while the enemy was concentrated in a single system. Any direct military response would require time to coordinate and execute, during which the political situation could deteriorate further. "Sir," said another cadet at a nearby workstation, "intelligence reports indicate that hegemony forces are constructing defensive installations around the system's primary planet. If they complete those fortifications, it will be much more difficult to dislodge them." Commander Sean nodded grimly. "Recommendations from strategic analysis?" The senior cadets began proposing various military responses: rapid deployment of available forces, requests for additional ships from other fleet commands, and diplomatic initiatives to buy time for military preparation. All were reasonable suggestions, but Marcus noticed that they shared a common assumption about what the exercise was testing. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Marcus requested. Commander Sean looked surprised, but nodded. "Go ahead, Cadet Chun. I think we may be approaching this backwards," Marcus said carefully. "Everyone's focusing on how to remove hegemony forces from the system, but we should consider why they're there in the first place." "Explain." Marcus activated his workstation's display and highlighted economic data about the Centauri system. The hegemony claims this is about protecting commercial interests, but their trade volume in this system is actually quite small. Less than 8% of total traffic. Meanwhile, coalition and neutral traffic accounts for over 70%. Commander Sean leaned forward, interested. "Continue." "If the hegemony's real objective is to disrupt coalition commerce, occupying the system actually works against them. They're now responsible for protecting trade routes that mostly benefit their opponents. Marcus brought up additional economic data. But if we respond with military force, we're the ones disrupting commerce and giving them exactly what they wanted. The command center had grown quiet as other cadets stopped their work to listen to Marcus's analysis. Commander Sean studied the economic data thoughtfully. You're suggesting we don't respond militarily? I am suggesting we respond commercially, Marcus replied. Instead of fighting for control of the trade routes, we offer to help the hegemony administer them, turn their occupation into a partnership. A Corvin cadet named Jex spoke up from across the room. That's appeasement. It encourages further aggression. Actually, it's engagement, Marcus countered. Right now, the hegemony sees the coalition as a threat to their expansion. But if we can demonstrate that cooperation is more profitable than conquest, we change the entire dynamic. Commander Sean was quiet for several minutes, studying Marcus's proposal. Finally, she nodded slowly. It's unconventional, but worth exploring. Draft a detailed recommendation for command staff review. Over the next several hours, Marcus worked with a team of cadets to develop a comprehensive proposal for economic engagement with the hegemony forces. The plan involved establishing joint commercial patrols, shared revenue from trade tariffs, and technology exchanges that would benefit both sides. When the proposal was presented to the exercise's senior command staff, it generated considerable debate. Some senior cadets argued that it showed weakness and invited further aggression. Others pointed out that it might provide a face-saving way for the hegemony to withdraw without military confrontation. Admiral Korath himself appeared in the command center to observe the debate, though he made no comment on the proceedings. His presence added weight to the discussion and reminded everyone that their performance was being carefully evaluated. The proposal has merit, admitted the cadet serving as Admiral-in-Chief for the exercise. But it requires the hegemony to act in good faith. What if they view our offer as weakness and escalate their demands? Marcus had anticipated this concern. Then we implement graduated economic pressure. Start with reduced cooperation and escalate to selective embargoes if necessary. Economic warfare can be just as effective as military action and much more precise in its targeting. The debate continued through most of the first day, with cadets arguing various aspects of the proposal. Some suggested modifications to make it more attractive to the hegemony, while others recommended preparations for military backup in case the diplomatic approach failed. Finally, the senior command staff decided to try Marcus's approach, with military forces positioned for rapid response if negotiations broke down. The exercise's scenario adapted to reflect this decision, introducing new complications as the hegemony leadership responded to the coalition's unexpected offer. To Marcus's surprise, the simulated negotiations proved more complex than simple military action would have been. The hegemony forces were divided in their response, with some factions favoring the economic partnership while others pressed for continued military occupation. Managing these internal divisions required careful diplomacy and strategic use of economic incentives. This is actually harder than fighting them, complained Zix during a brief break between scenario updates. At least in combat, you know who your enemies are. True, Marcus agreed, but it's also more sustainable. Military victories are temporary, but economic partnerships can last for generations. The exercise continued to evolve over the following days, with new challenges arising from both the hegemony negotiations and domestic coalition politics. Some coalition member species were uncomfortable with the idea of rewarding hegemony aggression with economic benefits, while others worried that military inaction would encourage future crises. Marcus found himself increasingly involved in developing solutions to these political challenges. His role evolved from tactical analyst to strategic advisor, working directly with the senior command staff to refine and adapt the engagement strategy. You realize you've essentially redesigned this entire exercise. Commander Sean observed one evening as they reviewed the latest scenario developments. We were supposed to be conducting military operations, and Instead, we're running a diplomatic and economic simulation. The exercise is supposed to test our ability to handle real-world crises, Marcus replied. Real-world crises are usually more complicated than pure military problems. By the end of the first week, the exercise scenario had developed into a complex multilateral negotiation involving not just coalition and hegemony forces, but also neutral systems and commercial interests affected by the crisis. The solution required coordination between military, diplomatic, and economic agencies across multiple species and political systems. The final week brought the ultimate test of the cadets' approach. Intelligence reports indicated that a hardline faction within the hegemony was planning to overthrow the moderates who had been negotiating with the coalition. If successful, this coup would not only end the diplomatic process, but also lead to a much more aggressive hegemony expansion program. Military response is now unavoidable, declared the senior cadet serving as defense minister. We have to act before the hardliners take control. But Marcus saw a different option. What if we help the moderates stay in power? The suggestion drew shocked looks from around the command center. Help the enemy, asked Jex incredulously. Help the faction that's willing to work with us, Marcus corrected. The moderates have been negotiating in good faith. They're not our enemies unless we make them our enemies. The proposal to provide covert support to hegemony moderates was even more controversial than the original economic engagement strategy. It required the coalition to effectively pick sides in an internal hegemony political dispute with all the risks and moral complications that entailed. Admiral Korath stepped forward during this debate, speaking for the first time since the exercise began. Cadet Chun, he said quietly, you're proposing that the coalition involve itself in the domestic politics of a foreign power. That's a dangerous precedent. Marcus stood at attention, knowing that his response could determine not just his own fate, but the success of the entire exercise. Yes, sir, but the alternative is allowing a faction dedicated to military expansion to gain control of a significant military force on our border. That's also dangerous. And if our intervention is discovered, if it becomes public that the coalition has been manipulating hegemony politics, then we accept responsibility and work to rebuild trust with whatever government emerges, Marcus replied. But if we do nothing and the hardliners take power, we'll face a much more serious military threat within months. Admiral Korath studied Marcus for a long moment before nodding slowly. Continue with your analysis, cadet. The final days of the exercise tested every skill the cadets had developed over their time at the academy. The operation to support hegemony moderates required careful coordination between intelligence assets, diplomatic contacts, and economic leverage. Military forces had to be positioned to provide support if needed, while maintaining the appearance of non-involvement. Marcus found himself at the center of the planning process, not because of his rank or formal authority, but because his unconventional approach had become the framework for the entire operation. Other cadets who had initially been skeptical of his methods now sought his input on their own aspects of the mission. I never expected to spend my final exercise conducting political analysis instead of fleet maneuvers, Vex admitted as they worked together on contingency planning. But this is probably more realistic than conventional military scenarios. The exercise reached its climax when the hegemony coup attempt began. The moderate faction, supported by carefully provided coalition intelligence and economic assistance, managed to retain control, but only barely. The hardliners were defeated, but not destroyed, leaving ongoing political instability that would require continued attention. When the exercise finally concluded, the command center was filled with exhausted but satisfied cadets. They had navigated the crisis without major military casualties and established a framework for ongoing cooperation with a moderate hegemony government. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a sustainable one. Admiral Korath addressed the assembled cadets as the simulation wound down. This exercise was designed to test your ability to handle complex, real-world crises that don't have simple military solutions. Your performance exceeded expectations in several important ways. He paused to look around the command center, his gaze lingering on Marcus. Military leadership in the modern era requires more than tactical skill and strategic thinking. It requires the ability to see beyond conventional approaches and find solutions that serve long-term interests rather than short-term objectives. The Admiral's final comments were followed by individual performance reviews, conducted privately with each cadet. When Marcus's turn came, he found himself facing not just Admiral Korath, but also several other senior Academy staff members he didn't recognize. Cadet Chun, Admiral Korath began, your performance during this exercise has been remarkable. Not just competent, but genuinely innovative. You've demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that the Coalition needs as we face an increasingly complex galactic environment. Marcus felt a surge of pride, but tried to remain professional. Thank you, sir. I was fortunate to work with an excellent team. Indeed you were. But leadership is partly about bringing out the best in excellent teams. Admiral Korath paused. I'm recommending you for accelerated advancement to the Advanced Strategic Studies program, with a specialty in crisis management and unconventional warfare. Marcus was stunned. The Advanced Strategic Studies program was reserved for the top graduates from each class, leading directly to senior staff positions in the Coalition Defense Force. He had never imagined being considered for such an opportunity. Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility. Admiral Korath smiled. The first time Marcus had seen him show such an expression. Cadet Chun, qualification isn't about being the strongest or fastest or even the smartest. It's about being able to see what others miss and find solutions that actually work. As Marcus left the Admiral's office, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 8 months ago, he had arrived at the Academy as an uncertain representative of a species that most galactic citizens viewed with skepticism. He had been physically weaker than his classmates, culturally ignorant, and socially isolated. But somehow, those apparent disadvantages had become strengths. His outsider perspective had allowed him to see problems differently, while his species' history of internal conflict had taught him to look for solutions beyond simple military force. Most importantly, he had learned that proving himself didn't require becoming like everyone else. It required becoming the best version of himself. Human resilience, Marcus realized, wasn't about being tougher than the challenges you faced. It was about finding ways to turn those challenges into opportunities for growth. And sometimes the most powerful way to prove your worth was to do it quietly, consistently, and without fanfare until the results spoke for themselves. As he walked through the Academy's corridors toward his quarters, Marcus noticed that his fellow cadets looked at him differently now, not with skepticism or curiosity, but with respect. He had become not just a successful cadet, but a trusted colleague and leader. The transformation had been gradual, built through small victories and steady improvement rather than dramatic gestures. But it was complete nonetheless. Marcus Chun was no longer the questionable human experiment at the Academy. He was simply an officer in training whose capabilities happened to demonstrate that human resilience deserved a place among the stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he moved forward into advanced training and eventual service with the Coalition Defense Force. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had proven what he came to prove, not through strength or speed or conventional excellence, but through the distinctly human ability to adapt, persist, and find new ways forward when the old ways weren't enough. The galaxy was vast and full of challenges that would test the Coalition in ways that conventional military training couldn't anticipate. But Marcus was confident that humanity would meet those challenges in their own way, quietly, and effectively proving their worth one problem at a time.